In the small city of Columbia, South Carolina, on a warm September evening, Tanesha lay in a hospital bed, cradling her newborn son against her chest. The delivery had been arduous, stretching through the late hours of the night, leaving her exhausted but triumphant. Her body ached, but as she gazed down at the tiny face nestled in her arms, a wave of serenity washed over her, dissolving the pain of the past hours. The baby's delicate features, still soft and new, seemed to glow under the dim, fluorescent lights of the hospital room. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around hers, and she felt an overwhelming sense of love, as if every moment of her life had led to this quiet, perfect instant. Quentin, her husband, stood beside the bed, his tall frame slightly hunched as he leaned over to study the child. His hands, usually steady and sure from years of working as a mechanic, fidgeted nervously at his sides. His face, typically marked by a calm confidence earned through years of navigating life's challenges, betrayed a flicker of something else, surprise perhaps, or confusion. His dark eyes, usually warm and reassuring, narrowed slightly as they traced the contours of the baby's face. The infant, swaddled in a pale blue blanket, bore an uncanny resemblance to someone Quentin couldn't quite place at first. It wasn't until his gaze lingered on the child's wide, expressive eyes, the gentle curve of his tiny eyebrows, and the faint, unmistakable mole on his left cheek that a jolt of recognition hit him. The baby looked strikingly like the actor from the orange juice commercials, a face plastered across billboards along Interstate 26 and flashing on television screens during every commercial break. The actor's image was inescapable in Columbia. His bright smile, framed by a sunlit orchard, had become a local fixture, promoting a brand of juice that promised freshness and vitality. Quentin had seen the advertisements countless times, on the sides of buses, in grocery store aisles, even on the small TV in their living room. The actor's features were distinctive, those piercing eyes, the subtle arch of his brows, and that single perfectly placed mole. Now, as Quentin stared at his newborn son, those same features seemed to stare back at him, mirrored in miniature. His mind raced, grappling with the impossibility of the resemblance. He tried to shake the thought, attributing it to the haze of exhaustion that clouded his mind after hours of waiting in the hospital. After all, he hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, and the sterile smell of antiseptic, combined with the low hum of medical equipment, could make anyone's thoughts wander. Tanesha, oblivious to the storm brewing in her husband's mind, traced her finger gently along the baby's cheek, and marveling at his softness. Her own fatigue weighed heavily on her, but the joy of holding her son eclipsed everything else. She had dreamed of this moment for years, through countless doctor's visits and the emotional roller coaster of trying to conceive. The baby's arrival felt like a miracle, a tangible answer to her quiet prayers. She glanced up at Quentin, expecting to see the same awe and adoration in his eyes that she felt in her heart. Instead, she caught a fleeting shadow of unease on his face. His jaw was tight, his brow furrowed in a way that wasn't typical for him. She frowned slightly, assuming he was simply overwhelmed by the weight of new fatherhood, or perhaps worried about the hospital bills piling up. Quentin wasn't one to wear his emotions openly, and she told herself that his expression was just a reflection of the long night they'd both endured. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of a monitor in the corner and the occasional murmur of nurses passing in the hallway. Outside, the September sky had deepened into a rich indigo, dotted with stars that peeked through the window blinds. Tanesha shifted slightly in the bed, careful not to disturb the baby, who had begun to stir, his tiny lips puckering as if dreaming of his first meal. She adjusted the blanket around him, tucking it snugly against his small body, and let her mind drift to the future. She imagined bringing him home to their modest house on the outskirts of Columbia, a cozy 2-bedroom with a small backyard where she'd already pictured him taking his first steps. She thought of the life they would build together, the 3 of them, her, Quentin, and their son, creating a family filled with love and laughter. Quentin, meanwhile, remained rooted to his spot beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the child. The resemblance gnawed at him, an insistent whisper in the back of his mind that he couldn't silence. He tried to focus on the practical, checking the time, wondering when the nurse would return, thinking about the drive home. but the image of the actor's face kept resurfacing, superimposed over the baby's. He told himself it was coincidence, a trick of the mind. Babies often looked like no one in particular at first, their features still forming, open to interpretation. Yet the mole, the eyes, the shape of the face, it was too precise, too unmistakable. He clenched his fists, feeling a pang of guilt for the thoughts creeping into his head. This was his son, the child he and Tanesha had waited for, the one they had planned and hoped for together. He wanted to feel nothing but pride and joy, but the doubt lingered, a quiet intruder in what should have been a sacred moment. Tanesha, sensing his stillness, reached out and touched his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. She smiled softly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but bright with love. She assumed his quiet demeanor was a sign of reverence, a man taking in the enormity of becoming a father. She had no inkling of the questions forming in his mind, no sense of the ripple effect this moment would have. For her, the world was complete in the weight of the baby in her arms, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the promise of a new chapter. Quentin forced a smile in return, his lips tight, and leaned down to kiss her forehead. He wanted to protect her, to shield this fragile happiness, but the seed of uncertainty had already taken root. As the night stretched on, the hospital room remained a quiet cocoon, holding the young family in a delicate balance, unaware of the storm that this fleeting moment of recognition would unleash. Several weeks had passed since the birth of their son, and the rhythm of life in the modest Columbia, South Carolina home had shifted to accommodate the demands of a newborn. Tanesha immersed herself fully in caring for the baby, whom they had named Lucas. Her days blurred into a cycle of feedings, diaper changes, and stolen moments of sleep, each task infused with a quiet joy that anchored her. The small house, with its creaky wooden floors and sun-faded curtains, felt alive with the sounds of Lucas's soft coos and occasional cries. Tanesha moved through the rooms with a new sense of purpose, her hands deftly folding tiny onesies or warming bottles, her heart swelling each time she looked into her son's wide, curious eyes. Lucas, with his delicate features and faint mole on his cheek, was her world, and she poured every ounce of her energy into nurturing him. Quentin, however, had grown increasingly distant. The warmth that once defined his presence in their home had cooled, replaced by a quiet unease that Tanesha couldn't quite decipher. He went through the motions of fatherhood, changing diapers when asked, rocking Lucas to sleep when Tanesha was too exhausted, but his actions felt mechanical, lacking the tenderness she had expected. His gaze often lingered on Lucas, not with the adoration Tanesha felt, but with a scrutiny that seemed to search for something beyond the surface. At night, when the house was still, Quentin would sit in the worn armchair in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, lost in thoughts he didn't share. The resemblance between Lucas and the actor from the orange juice commercials, which had struck him so sharply in the hospital, had not faded. If anything, it had grown more pronounced as Lucas's features settled in the weeks since his birth. The same expressive eyes, the same subtle curve of the brow, the same tiny mole, all were unmistakable echoes of the face Quentin saw daily on billboards and advertisements around Columbia. The weight of this observation pressed heavier on Quentin with each passing day. He had tried at first to dismiss it as a quirk of chance. Babies often resembled no one in particular, their faces a canvas of possibility that only later took on familial traits. But Lucas's likeness to the actor was too precise, too persistent. Quentin found himself studying the baby during quiet moments, while Tanesha bathed him, or, when he lay sleeping in his crib, the soft glow of a nightlight illuminating his face. Each glance deepened the knot of doubt in Quentin's chest. He began to notice the actor's face everywhere, on the side of a delivery truck, parked outside the grocery store, in a commercial that interrupted the evening news, on a crumpled magazine in the waiting room of his auto shop. The actor's smile, once a benign part of the city's backdrop, now felt like a taunt, a reminder of the question that gnawed at him. Tanesha, absorbed in the demands of motherhood, didn't immediately notice the change in Quentin. Her days were a whirlwind of new routines, and her nights were fractured by Lucas's feedings. She attributed Quentin's quietness to the adjustment of becoming a father, assuming he was grappling with the same overwhelming mix of love and responsibility that she felt. But as the weeks wore on, she began to sense the distance growing between them. Quentin's laughter, once a frequent sound in their home, had become rare. His touches, once warm and reassuring, were fleeting. He avoided meeting her eyes when they spoke, his responses clipped and distracted. Tanesha tried to bridge the gap, asking him about his day at the shop or sharing small stories about Luca's latest milestones, but his replies were curt, his attention elsewhere. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a golden glow through the living room windows, Tanesha sat on the couch, sorting through a pile of Lucas's clothes. The baby slept soundly in his crib in the next room, his soft breaths audible through the baby monitor. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the detergent Tanesha had used, and the hum of cicadas drifted in from the backyard. Quentin entered the room, his work boots leaving faint traces of grease on the floor. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the fading light, and for a long moment he said nothing. Tanesha glanced up, expecting him to sit beside her or offer to help, but instead he remained still, his hands shoved. 2 weeks had passed since Quentin's request for a DNA test, and the results arrived in a plain white envelope delivered unceremoniously to their small home in Columbia, South Carolina. Tanesha sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the window and casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Her hands trembled as she held the single sheet of paper, its clinical language spelling out a truth that felt like a betrayal of everything she had built with Quentin. The test confirmed that Quentin was not Lucas's biological father. The words blurred before her eyes as tears welled up, spilling silently down her cheeks. Her chest tightened, each breath a struggle against the weight of disbelief and sorrow. She stared at the paper, willing the results to change, but the stark reality remained. The kitchen, once a place of shared meals and quiet laughter, felt suffocating, the air thick with the unspoken accusations that had led to this moment. Quentin stood across the room, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold detachment. The warmth that had once defined his presence was gone, replaced by a distance that Tanesha could feel even from several feet away. His eyes, usually so expressive, were unreadable, fixed on a point somewhere beyond her. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Tanesha's mind raced, replaying every moment of their marriage, searching for a crack in her fidelity that could explain the impossible. She had never strayed, never given Quentin reason to doubt her. The idea that he could believe otherwise cut deeper than she could have imagined, a wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. She tried to speak, to insist that she had been faithful, that there had to be a mistake, but the words caught in her throat, drowned by the flood of emotions that overwhelmed her. Quentin, without a word, turned and moved toward their bedroom. Tanesha watched, frozen, as he began to pack a duffel bag with mechanical precision. He pulled shirts from the closet, folded them with care, and added a pair of jeans and his work boots. Each item he packed felt like another piece of their life being dismantled. Tanesha wanted to reach out, to stop him, to demand he stay and face this with her, but her body refused to move. The reality of the test results had created a chasm between them, one that neither seemed able to cross. When Quentin zipped the bag shut and slung it over his shoulder, he paused briefly at the door, his back to her. For a moment, Tanesha thought he might turn around, that he might see the pain in her eyes and reconsider. But he didn't. He walked out, the screen door slamming behind him, and drove away to his brother's house across town, leaving Tanesha alone with their son. The house felt emptier than it ever had, the silence oppressive. Lucas slept in his crib in the next room, unaware of the storm that had just torn through his parents' lives. Tanesha sat at the table for what felt like hours, the DNA test results still clutched in her hands, now crumpled and stained with her tears. The kitchen was cluttered with the remnants of their new routine, bottles drying on a rack, a stack of clean burp cloths, a half-empty box of diapers. These small details, once symbols of hope and joy, now seemed to mock her. She tried to make sense of the results, her mind spiraling through every possible explanation. She knew with absolute certainty that she had never been unfaithful. The love she and Quentin shared had been built on trust, on years of standing by each other through financial struggles, long hours at work, and the quiet ache of wanting a child. The test results didn't just challenge that trust, they shattered it, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. As the day wore on, Tanesha moved through the house in a daze, tending to Lucas when he woke, his soft cries pulling her back to the present. She fed him, changed him, and rocked him gently, her tears falling onto his tiny blanket. Holding him close, she studied his face, the delicate features that had brought her so much joy, now tainted by the shadow of doubt. The resemblance to the actor from the orange juice commercials, which she had once dismissed as a fleeting curiosity, loomed larger now, a puzzle she couldn't ignore. She tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the warmth of Lucas's small body against hers, but the question lingered, insistent and unyielding. How could this have happened? The answer felt just out of reach, buried somewhere in the fog of her grief and confusion. Late that night, as the house settled into a quiet darkness, Tanesha sat on the edge of her bed, Lucas asleep beside her in his bassinet. The room was lit only by the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds, casting slatted shadows across the walls. She stared at the ceiling, her mind retracing the path that had led them to this moment. She thought of the years they had spent trying to conceive, the countless doctors' visits, the tests, the disappointments. They had poured their hopes into the dream of a family, enduring the emotional toll of infertility with quiet resilience. When natural conception proved impossible, they had turned to a reproductive clinic in Colombia, a place that promised miracles through science. The process had been grueling, appointments, injections, endless paperwork, but it had culminated in Lucas, their miracle, their joy. As she lay there, a sudden realization broke through the haze of her thoughts. Lucas had been conceived through in vitro fertilization. The clinic, with its sterile rooms and meticulous procedures, had been the key to his existence. Tanesha's heart quickened as she considered the possibility that the answer lay not in betrayal, but in error. What if the clinic had made a mistake? The thought was both a lifeline and a new source of dread. She sat up, her mind racing with the implications. The clinic had handled countless samples, followed strict protocols, but human error was always possible. The idea that something had gone wrong during the procedure felt both impossible and plausible, a thread she could follow to unravel the mystery that had torn her family apart. Tanesha resolved to investigate, to dig into the records of the clinic and demand answers. The decision gave her a flicker of purpose, a way to channel the pain and confusion that threatened to consume her. She knew it would mean confronting a past she had hoped to leave behind, the months of uncertainty, the clinical coldness of the fertility process, the vulnerability of placing their dreams in the hands of strangers. But if there was a chance to understand what had happened, to restore the trust that had been broken, she would face it. As the night deepened, Tanesha lay back down, her hand resting lightly on Lucas's bassinet. The house was silent, save for the soft rhythm of her son's breathing, and in that moment, she clung to the hope that the truth, whatever it was, would bring her family back together. Tanesha drove to the reproductive clinic in Columbia, South Carolina, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the familiar streets. The building, a sleek, modern structure with large glass windows, stood on the edge of the city, its sterile facade a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. She had made an appointment the day before, her voice steady but firm over the phone, as she insisted on speaking with someone in charge. The clinic had been a place of hope years ago when she and Quentin had turned to it in their quest to start a family. But now it felt like the source of a wound that had fractured her life. She parked her car in the lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, and sat for a moment, gathering her resolve. The weight of the past weeks, the DNA test results, Quentin's departure, the unbearable silence of their home, pressed heavily on her, but she was determined to find answers. Inside, the clinic's reception area was as pristine as she remembered. White walls, soft lighting, and rows of neatly arranged chairs. The air carried the faint scent of antiseptic, and a receptionist typed quietly behind a polished counter. Tanesha approached, her steps deliberate, and requested to see the clinic's director. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile, hesitated, offering vague assurances that someone would assist her soon. Tanesha's patience, already worn thin, snapped. She leaned forward, her voice low but unyielding, and made it clear she would not leave without answers. She mentioned the possibility of legal action, her words carrying the weight of her desperation. The receptionist faltered, then made a quick phone call, and soon Tanesha was ushered into a small office down a long hallway. The office was sparsely furnished, with a desk cluttered with files and a single window overlooking the parking lot. The director, a middle-aged woman with a tight bun and a cautious demeanor, greeted Tanesha with a professionalism that felt rehearsed. Tanesha wasted no time explaining the DNA test results and demanding to know how such an error could have occurred. The director's responses were guarded, filled with technical jargon about protocols and safeguards, but Tanesha pressed harder, her questions sharp and unrelenting. She wanted access to the records of the procedure that had led to Lucas's conception, unwilling to accept vague assurances. The director hesitated, citing confidentiality, but Tanesha's threat to involve a lawyer and the media shifted the dynamic. After a tense pause, the director agreed to provide limited access to the relevant files, though she warned that the process would take time. Tanesha returned to the clinic the following day, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. She was led to a small conference room where a stack of documents awaited her. The files were dense with medical terminology, charts, consent forms, and procedural logs, but Tanesha pored over them with a focus she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, her eyes scanning for anything that might explain the impossible truth of Lucas's paternity. Hours passed, the room growing stuffy as the afternoon sun streamed through the blinds. Finally, buried in a folder marked with a string of numbers, she found a discrepancy. The records indicated that the sample used for her in vitro fertilization had been mislabeled due to a clerical error in the clinic's system. The sample intended to be Quintin's had been swapped with another, one donated as part of a promotional campaign for a sperm donor program. The revelation hit Tanesha like a physical blow. Her breath caught, and she leaned back in the chair, the documents slipping from her hands onto the table. The sample, according to the records, belonged to Nathan Reed, the actor whose face was plastered across every billboard and television screen in Colombia, advertising orange juice with his unmistakable smile. The clinic's error had been a simple one, a mislabeled vial, a momentary lapse in an overworked system, but its consequences had ended her life. Tanesha's mind reeled as she pieced together the implications. Nathan Reed, a stranger whose image had haunted her husband's thoughts, was Lucas's biological father. The realization was both a relief and a new source of pain, confirming her fidelity but replacing one uncertainty with another. The clinic's staff, aware of the gravity of the mistake, attempted to downplay the incident. The director returned to the room, offering apologies laced with bureaucratic defensiveness, assuring Tanesha that such errors were rare and that the clinic would cooperate fully. But Tanesha barely heard her. Her thoughts were consumed by the image of Lucas, his tiny face so clearly reflecting Nathan's features, the expressive eyes, the curved brows, the mole on his cheek. She felt a surge of anger toward the clinic for their carelessness, but also a strange clarity. The truth, painful as it was, gave her something tangible to hold on to, a way to explain the unexplainable to Quintin, if he would ever listen. Determined to take control of the situation, Tanesha requested a copy of the records, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The director complied, though her reluctance was palpable. Tanesha left the clinic with a manila folder tucked under her arm, the weight of the documents grounding her as she stepped into the humid afternoon air. Back at home, with Lucas napping in his crib, Tanesha sat at the kitchen table and searched online for Nathan Reed. His name brought up a flood of images, commercials, interviews, promotional photos, but also contact information for his agent. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before drafting an email. She explained the situation with as much clarity as she could muster, describing the clinic's error and the child who bore his likeness. She didn't know what she expected, anger, denial, indifference. But she sent the message, driven by a need to confront the truth head on. To her surprise, Nathan's response came within hours. His email was brief but kind, expressing shock at the situation and a willingness to meet in person to discuss it further. Tanesha stared at the screen, her heart racing. The idea of meeting Nathan, of facing the man whose unintended role had reshaped her family, was daunting, but she knew it was necessary. She replied, suggesting a time and place in Colombia, her fingers trembling as she typed. As she closed her laptop, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the baby monitor. Lucas slept peacefully, unaware of the revelations that had just unfolded. Tanesha leaned back in her chair, exhaustion settling into her bones, but also a flicker of resolve. She had uncovered the truth, and now she would face whatever came next for herself, for Lucas, and for the family she still hoped to salvage. A week after Tanesha sent her email, Nathan Reed arrived in Columbia, South Carolina, his presence in the small city feeling almost surreal to her. She had chosen a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town for their meeting, a place tucked away from the bustle of downtown with wooden tables and large windows that let in the soft light of a late afternoon. Tanesha arrived early, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse as she sat at a corner table, the faint aroma of coffee and fresh pastries filling the air. Her nerves were frayed, her mind racing with questions about what this encounter would mean. She had spent the past days oscillating between resolve and uncertainty, wondering how she would face the man whose unintended role had upended her life. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few patrons reading newspapers or typing on laptops, and the soft hum of a ceiling fan provided a steady backdrop to her anxious thoughts. Nathan walked in just as the sun dipped lower, casting golden streaks across the cafe's tiled floor. He was taller than Tanesha had expected, his presence carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized. Yet there was no trace of arrogance in his demeanor as he approached her table, his expression open and curious. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, a far cry from the polished image of the orange juice commercials, but his face was unmistakable, those expressive eyes, the gentle curve of his brows, the mole on his cheek that mirrored Lucas's. Tanesha stood to greet him, her heart pounding, but Nathan's warm smile and unhurried handshake eased some of her tension. They sat, and for a moment, they simply regarded each other, two strangers bound by an extraordinary twist of fate. The conversation began slowly, with Tanesha recounting the clinic's error, her voice steady but laced with the weight of the past weeks. Nathan listened intently, his hands folded on the table, his gaze never wavering. He explained that he had donated his sample as part of a promotional campaign for a sperm donor program, a decision made years ago during a whirlwind of media appearances. He had been told the donation would be handled with strict confidentiality, used only with explicit consent, and the idea that it had been misused left him visibly shaken. His sincerity was disarming, and Tanesha found herself relaxing slightly, the knot in her chest loosening as she realized he was as blindsided by the situation as she was. Nathan's shock was tempered by a quiet empathy, and when Tanesha mentioned Lucas, his expression softened further, a flicker of curiosity and concern crossing his face. Nathan expressed a desire to see the child, not out of entitlement but from a genuine need to understand the reality of what had happened. Tanesha hesitated, her protective instincts flaring, but something in Nathan's demeanor, his openness, his lack of pretense, convinced her to trust him, at least for this moment. She agreed to take him to her home, a decision that felt both monumental and necessary. They left the cafe together, Tanesha driving while Nathan followed in his rental car. The short journey through Columbia's tree-lined streets passing in a blur. Her small house came into view, its weathered exterior and overgrown front yard, a stark contrast to the polished world Nathan inhabited. As they stepped inside, the familiar smells of baby powder and lavender detergent greeted them, grounding Tanesha in the space that had been her refuge and her battleground. Lucas was asleep in his crib, tucked into the corner of the living room where Tanesha could always keep an eye on him. The room was softly lit by a lamp, its glow casting gentle shadows across the walls. Tanesha led Nathan to the crib, her heart racing as she watched him take in the sight of the sleeping child. Lucas lay on his side, his tiny chest rising and falling, his face peaceful in the way only a baby's could be. The resemblance was undeniable. A mirror of Nathan's features in miniature, the same wide eyes now closed, the same delicate brows, the same mole on his cheek. Nathan stood frozen, his breath catching as he studied the boy. For a moment he seemed lost, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief, as if seeing a part of himself in a way he had never anticipated. Tanesha watched him closely, searching for any sign of overreach. But what she saw instead was a quiet warmth, a tenderness that surprised her. Nathan stepped back from the crib, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as if to anchor himself. He turned to Tanesha, his eyes reflecting a complex mix of emotions: shock, curiosity, and something akin to respect. He made it clear that he had no intention of disrupting her life or claiming a role that wasn't his. His only request was to know that Lucas was well, to have some small connection to the child whose existence he had unknowingly contributed to. The sincerity in his words struck Tanesha, and though she still grappled with feelings of guilt and confusion, she found herself nodding in agreement. The idea of Nathan having a distant, respectful presence in Lucas's life felt manageable, a way to acknowledge the truth without letting it consume the family she was fighting to preserve. As they stood in the quiet living room, the weight of the moment settled over Tanesha. She looked at Lucas, his small form a reminder of the love that had brought him into her life, and she felt a shift within her. The clinic's error, Nathan's unexpected role, Quentin's absence, all of it had threatened to unravel her. But in this moment, she saw Lucas for what he was: her son, hers to protect and nurture, no matter the circumstances of his conception. The realization was a lifeline, pulling her out of the fog of doubt and pain. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that she would need to confront Quentin with the truth and rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of clarity. Lucas was hers, and she would do whatever it took to ensure he grew up surrounded by love. Nathan left the house shortly after, promising to stay in touch, but respecting the boundaries Tanesha had set. As his car pulled away, Tanesha stood at the door, watching the taillights disappear into the evening. The house was quiet again, save for the soft sounds of Lucas stirring in his crib. Tanesha returned to him, adjusting his blanket with a tenderness that felt renewed. The encounter with Nathan had been a bridge between the past she hadn't chosen and the future she was determined to shape. She sat beside the crib, her hand resting lightly on its edge, and let herself imagine a life where Lucas could grow up whole, loved not despite the truth but because of the strength it had demanded from her. The path forward was uncertain, but in that moment Tanesha felt a quiet resolve, a determination to hold her family together, no matter what lay ahead. A month had passed since Quentin left the small house in Columbia, South Carolina, and in that time, the quiet evenings he spent at his brother's place had been filled with introspection. The modest apartment, with its mismatched furniture and the constant hum of a television in the background, had become a refuge where Quentin wrestled with his thoughts. He sat alone most nights, staring out the window at the streetlights flickering in the distance, replaying the events that had driven him away from Tanesha and Lucas. The DNA test results had shaken him to his core, but as the weeks wore on, the anger and doubt that had consumed him began to give way to a deeper truth. His love for Tanesha, forged through years of shared struggles and dreams, and his bond with Lucas, the child he had held in the hospital with such awe, was stronger than the questions that had torn him apart. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over the horizon, and with it came a pang of guilt for the pain he had caused by walking away. Quentin returned to the house on a crisp October afternoon, the air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. He stood at the front door, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and trepidation. The house looked much the same, its weathered siding, the overgrown weeds in the front yard, but it felt different, as if it held the weight of the time he had been gone. Tanesha opened the door, her face a careful mask of restraint, her eyes betraying the hurt that still lingered. She stepped aside to let him in, her movements deliberate, and Quentin crossed the threshold. The familiar creak of the floorboards grounding him in the space he had once called home. The living room was cluttered with the signs of Lucas's presence. A bassinet in the corner, a stack of diapers on the coffee table, a soft blanket draped over the couch. The air smelled of lavender and baby powder, a reminder of the life Tanesha had continued to nurture in his absence. Tanesha had spent the past month navigating the demands of motherhood alone, her days filled with caring for Lucas, and her nights haunted by the uncertainty of her marriage. She had learned of the clinic's error through her own investigation, a truth that had both relieved and complicated her pain. The knowledge that Quentin's doubts had been rooted in a mistake, not betrayal, had softened some of her anger, but the wounds of his departure remained raw. She had carried on for Lucas, determined to provide him with the love and stability she had always envisioned, but the emptiness of Quentin's absence had been a constant ache. When he appeared at the door, she felt a flicker of joy, but it was tempered by caution, a guard against the possibility of further hurt. Quentin set his bag down in the hallway, his eyes scanning the room as if reacquainting himself with its details. Tanesha stood across from him, her arms crossed, waiting for him to break the silence. The tension between them was palpable, a fragile thread stretched taut by the weight of what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. Quentin had spent his time away reflecting on the life they had built together. The late nights talking about their future, the sacrifices they had made to afford the fertility treatments, the joy of learning Tanesha was pregnant. He had come to understand that his love for Lucas was not tied to biology, but to the moments they had shared and the ones he hoped to create. The clinic's mistake had been a painful revelation, but it had also freed him from the shadow of doubt, replacing it with a resolve to rebuild what he had nearly destroyed. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where the DNA test results had shattered their world, and spent hours talking. The conversation was slow at first, each word chosen carefully, but as the evening deepened, it grew more open, a bridge between their past and the uncertain future. They reminisced about the early days of their relationship, the small apartment they had shared when they were first married, the dreams they had woven together. They spoke of Lucas, of the way his tiny hand gripped their fingers, of the soft sounds he made in his sleep. Quentin's guilt surfaced, a heavy weight he carried for not trusting Tanesha, for letting his fear override his love. Tanesha listened, her heart softening but still guarded, her own pain a reminder of the trust that needed to be rebuilt. Later that evening, Quentin approached Lucas's crib, where the baby lay sleeping, his small chest rising and falling under a soft blanket. Tanesha watched from the doorway, her breath catching as Quentin reached down and gently lifted the child into his arms. Lucas stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again, and Quentin's face broke into a smile, the first genuine one Tanesha had seen in months. He held Lucas close, studying his delicate features, the wide eyes, the curved brows, the mole on his cheek, and felt a surge of love that transcended the questions of biology. In that moment, Lucas was his son, not because of blood, but because of the choice to love him, to raise him, to be there for every milestone and every challenge. Tanesha felt tears prick her eyes, a mix of relief and hope stirring within her. Nathan Reed, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance. He had sent a small gift for Lucas, a soft stuffed bear with a blue ribbon, along with a note wishing Tanesha and her family well. The gesture was thoughtful, a reminder of his presence without crossing the boundaries Tanesha had set. She kept the bear on a shelf in Lucas's room, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth they had faced, but her focus remained on the family she was rebuilding. Nathan's occasional messages, always brief and considerate, offered updates on his life, but never pressed for more than Tanesha was willing to give. His restraint allowed Tanesha to move forward without the weight of an unwanted obligation, a balance that she came to appreciate. As the days turned into weeks, Tanesha and Quentin settled into a tentative new rhythm. The house, once marked by silence and absence, began to feel like a home again. Quentin returned to his job at the auto shop, his hands steady as he worked on engines, but his evenings were spent with Tanesha and Lucas, helping with feedings or rocking the baby to sleep. Tanesha, though still healing from the pain of the past months, found moments of joy in Quentin's presence. The way he laughed when Lucas grabbed his finger, the quiet pride in his eyes when he held his son. They were cautious with each other, mindful of the fragility of their renewed connection. But each small gesture, a shared glance, a touch on the shoulder, built a foundation stronger than before. The crisis they had endured had changed them, stripping away the illusions of certainty and replacing them with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a family. Tanisha and Quinton came to see their bond not as a given, but as a choice, one they made every day in the face of uncertainty. Lucas, with his innocent smiles and quiet trust, was the heart of that choice, a reminder of the love that had brought them together and the strength that would carry them forward. As the autumn leaves fell outside their window, Tanisha and Quinton sat together in the living room, Lucas asleep between them, and felt the quiet power of a family forged not by blood, but by the decision to love, no matter what.